Hello there, it's great to see you all again. Welcome back. Now, if you've been watching the newspaper or the internet or television, you cannot fail to have seen over the last few weeks and months the way that this country and especially America has become convulsed about the whole subject of slavery, racism and slavery. And what I'd like to do for you over the next few minutes, I'd like to read to you a sermon that I preached back in 2007. It was a sermon preached to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade. I'm going to read that to you. I'm going to read, it's virtually a full text. I'm going to read the text. I'm not going to try and pretend somehow that there's a congregation out there, so I'm not going to try and preach it as I might normally do, but I'm going to read the text of the sermon to you. There's a couple of Bible passages to go with it. I'm going to read those. But before we do that, I'd just like to say, if I was doing this again today, if I was preaching this sermon again today, I think one thing I would do differently is I would bring out much more the role of William Wilberforce. Wilberforce is usually remembered as the guy who abolished the slave trade. Well, that's true. Wilberforce abolished an institution, but he actually did much more than that. Wilberforce also abolished a mindset. He abolished not just the institution of slavery, he abolished the mindset that lay behind the institution. And it's one thing to abolish an institution, and as venerable as slavery has been, as we shall see, it's one thing to do that. It's quite another thing altogether to make slavery seem somehow impossible ever again. And that is Wilberforce's greatest achievement. He didn't just abolish an institution, he changed hearts and minds. It's a towering achievement, what Wilberforce did. So that's what I do differently. But here we go. Let's go from the top, shall we? Two Bible passages. First of all, from the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 25, verses 42 to 46. Because the Israelites are my servants, says God, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living amongst you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. And the New Testament passage is from St. Paul's letter to Philemon, which has the whole subject of slavery in it. Philemon, verses 8 to 16, where St. Paul says, Therefore, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do, yet I appeal to you on the basis of love. I then, as Paul, an old man, and now a prisoner of Christ Jesus, I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who became my son while I was in chains. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful both to you and me. I am sending him who is my very heart back to you. I would like to keep him with me, so that he could take your place with me in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favour you do will be spontaneous and not forced. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a while was that you might have him back for good, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, and even dearer to you both as a man and as a brother in the Lord. Today, we commemorate the passing of the Act to abolish the slave trade in 1807. Some of that story will be well known to you. Perhaps the lives and works of the central characters, William Wilberforce, John Newton, and the rest of them, are well known to you. This morning, I want to look at the whole subject of slavery in a wider context. I want to look at the question of why. Why was slavery abolished when it was? Why did it happen in the countries of Western Europe and America, first of all? And why was the Bible important? And perhaps most importantly, why did it take so long? As Christians, I believe it is vital that we look at these things, for at the end of the day, as I shall attempt to show, the abolition of the slave trade was a distinctively Christian achievement. As one writer has remarked, only once has effective moral opposition to slavery arisen. For this, Christian theology was essential. Out of all the world's religions, only in Christianity did the idea develop that slavery was sinful and must be abolished. Our task this morning is to trace how that realization came about. Perhaps the first thing to say about slavery is that it has been just about a universal human institution. Wherever a society could afford it, slavery was practiced. The great empires of antiquity, the Greek and the Roman empires, were slave economies. If you look at the Old Testament does not treat slavery as a divinely ordained institution as such. But as we have heard from our reading from Leviticus, the Israelites were permitted to practice a form of slavery. However, in the Old Testament, slavery was tightly regulated. If a master killed a slave, he too was to be put to death. If he badly mistreated a slave, the slave was to be set free because of that mistreatment. Slaves too had rights. They could not be made to work on the Sabbath, for example. Most significant of all is Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 42. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, says God, they must not be sold as slaves. The Israelites could not enslave one another. As the people of God, they were forbidden to do so. So in the Old Testament, slavery, whilst present, is never seen as God's will. In the Old Testament, the institution of slavery is transcended by a person belonging to the people of God. If we move to the New Testament, you will find a similar position. Jesus did not keep slaves. This is an important point to which we shall return. The 12 disciples did not keep slaves. Yet nowhere is the New Testament church told to dismantle the institution of slavery as such. The nearest to it is Paul's first letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. Where St. Paul says, we also know that law is not made for the righteous, but for the law breakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for adulterers and perverts, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. We had a reading from Paul's letter to Philemon. Paul wrote this letter on behalf of his friend and colleague Onesimus, who was a runaway slave from his master Philemon. Both Philemon and Onesimus had become Christians. Whilst Paul does not command Philemon to release Onesimus, nevertheless, he does say this. Philemon verses 15 and 16. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back for good, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you both as a man and as a brother in the Lord. Again, as in the Old Testament, the institution of slavery is transcended by a person belonging to the people of God. So when we look at the Bible and slavery, we must note that whilst it does accept slavery as being part of the conditions of life at the time it was written, nevertheless, the Bible never equates slavery with the will of God. And it shows that slavery is transcended by relationships among the people of God. One writer puts the Bible's view on slavery in these terms. The Bible's teaching creates the possibility that slavery could be ended. It doesn't as such mandate the ending of slavery, but it does provide an understanding of what God has done in the world through Christ, such that it opens up the door through which slavery could be abolished. All that was needed was for the right conditions to come along. These conditions gradually came along as Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire. By and large, over the centuries, as Christian teaching has gained ground, so slavery began to diminish. A good example of the early church's opposition to slavery is found in St. Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers, who in about 195 AD said, "Domestic servants are to be treated like ourselves, for they are human beings as we are. God is the same to slave and free." Indeed, as we pass into the Middle Ages, as Europe became the first Christian continent, slavery was sharply diminished as a feature of society. Christian kings and saints tried to stamp it out wherever they could. For example, William the Conqueror moved against slavery after the Norman invasion, such that by the 12th century slavery was effectively abolished in Britain. At this point we should note, as slavery was pushed to the margins of medieval Christian society, it continued apace in Muslim lands, Africa and the Far East. One estimate puts it that by 1600 AD, about 7 million Africans had been imported from Africa to the Muslim lands of the Middle East. Muslim countries also enslaved people in the Balkans, part of what we would call Eastern Europe, and even for a period, parts of England. In the Christian West, slavery began again in a serious way at the discovery of the New World in the 16th and the 17th centuries. Slavery was seen as a way of exploiting the economic potential of these newly discovered territories. However, right at the start of this new era of slave trading, the whole practice was met with strong Christian opposition. The 16th century Pope Paul III issued a decree in which he maintained, quote, "We, noticing that the Indians are true men, by our apostolic authority decree solemnly that the same Indians and all other peoples, even though they are outside the faith, should not be deprived of their liberty, and are not to be reduced to slavery," unquote. The same Pope also went on to decree that any who became involved in the slave trade were to be excommunicated. Sadly, the Pope's admonitions went unheeded, and the transatlantic slave trade went ahead on a massive scale. Many Western nations were involved in this trade. However, by all accounts, the worst treatment to slaves was meted out by the British. Other nations, such as France and Spain, had codes of practice for slave traders, preventing the worst excesses of abuse. The British had none. Even the Church of England found itself party to this trading, owning as it did a slave plantation in the West Indies. We must be in no doubt as to the economic benefits that slavery brought to the British economy. If slavery were to end, then quite literally a price would have to be paid. As we now turn to the start of the abolition movement, we can say that this movement was largely the invention of the Quakers of the 18th century. This Quaker-led, avowedly religious movement quickly spread from America to Quakers in England. The abolition movement found two key allies. In the Methodist evangelist John Wesley, it was Wesley who began a nationwide tour preaching against slavery, and the other key figure was, of course, William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was an evangelical Anglican, a member of the famous Clapham sect. It was Wilberforce who introduced legislation in Parliament to abolish the slave trade in 1792. Wilberforce was a man who was motivated by his Christian conviction. He believed that all men were created equal by God. He believed Jesus' command to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Only after several attempts was the slave trade finally abolished in 1807. Slavery itself was abolished in 1833. And again, we should be under no illusion as to the price that had to be paid. There was a direct cost to the economy. The price of sugar rose sharply. One economist called the end of the slave trade in Britain economic suicide. Other Western nations soon followed Britain's suit. As I've tried to say, the opposition and eventual abolition of slavery was a distinctively Christian effort. Whatever mistakes and compromises the church had made down through the centuries, especially in regard to slavery. As the Bible never equates slavery with the will of God, there is no doubt that the Bible's teaching on what it means to be a member of the people of God, the personal example of Jesus himself and his disciples, these things, in the end, proved to be decisive. Today, we owe a great debt to the abolitionists, to their courage, to their determination, and to their faith. Be seeing you.